Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today and welcome to our September AuthorConnect webinar. I'm Michelle, Chief of Staff at BookPal, and I'm thrilled to be here today with two of our favorite authors, Jocko Willink and Leif Babin, to discuss their newest book, The Dichotomy of Leadership. We've been working with Jocko and Leif since the launch of their first book, Extreme Ownership, in 2015, and not only are they amazing partners, they're very talented writers and speakers. I had the pleasure of hearing them speak at their very first muster conference in San Diego back in 2016, and I've read both of their books, so I can say firsthand that these guys know their stuff. Jocko and Leif served as U.S. Navy SEAL officers in one of the most highly decorated Special Operations Unit of the Iraq War. After returning, Jocko and Leif documented the crucial lessons learned, and in 2012 they founded Echelon Front, a leadership training company that teaches others how to build, train, and lead the most effective, high-performing winning teams. Their previous book, Extreme Ownership, reached #1 on the New York Times bestsellers list, and Jocko has also authored the best-selling books Discipline Equals Freedom and The Way of the Warrior Kid series. As a preview of what's to come, Jocko and Leif will start with a quick introduction to their new book, The Dichotomy of Leadership, and then we'll jump into a question and answer session. Thank you to everyone for submitting your questions ahead of time. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Just as a reminder, in case you need to jump off early, we'll be sending out the webinar recording to all attendees next week. Without further ado, I'll let Jocko and Leif kick us off.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks, Michelle. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We have another book coming out, as Michelle just mentioned. It's called The Dichotomy of Leadership, and I wanted to start off very quickly just by saying that Leif and I, almost probably 6 months from when Extreme Ownership came out and it did well, and the publisher saw that it was doing well, and that made them tell us almost immediately that they wanted us to write another book right now. And we didn't want to rush into it. We wanted to take our time and make sure that we developed something that was worth talking about. We didn't want to write a book just for the sake of writing a book. So as we continue to work with companies and leaders around America and around the world, we started to see a trend in what we had written in the book Extreme Ownership in something that we needed to focus a little bit more on, and that something was the last chapter in Extreme Ownership, which is called The Dichotomy of Leadership, and it's about balancing these opposing forces that are pulling you as a leader in opposite directions. And that was one of the trickiest things that people have as leaders, one of the hardest skills to develop. And so after a couple of years, we finally looked at each other after getting asked question upon question about how to balance these dichotomies. We finally looked at each other and said, oh, well, it's pretty obvious what the next book needs to be about. Leif?
And this book answers those questions. I mean, this is the most common problems that we see, even from really highly motivated leaders who have read Extreme Ownership multiple times and are trying hard to implement this and lead, as effectively as they can, lead the best high-performing winning teams they can. This is what they struggle with. Just as we struggle with it, it's the hardest thing to do is balance between these two opposing forces, and that's what the dichotomy is about. So we're very proud of the content of this book, and I think in many ways leaders may find it more useful. In the dichotomy, more useful than Extreme Ownership.
Yeah. Michelle, can we go to the next slide? So yeah, this is us. Obviously, we are not the best looking guys in the world and really didn't have much of a future in a modeling career. So luckily, we started writing instead. Next slide. All right, so the first part of the book, this book, like Extreme Ownership, is broken into 3 sections. It's balancing people, balancing the mission, and then balancing yourself. And just like Extreme Ownership, we also broke it down into 3 sections inside of each chapter. The first thing is a story that's either from the SEAL teams when we were in combat or when we were working in training or going through training. And then we define the principle that we're talking about inside the chapter. And then we talk about, or we tell a story or a vignette from the civilian sector, from a business that we work with, from a leader that we did some consulting with that really kind of magnifies the lessons learned and how to carry out these principles most effectively in the civilian sector. So the first section is called Balancing People. Leif, you want to hit that one a little bit?
Yeah, this section is just about how to balance those teams, and I, in particular, Jocko and I had some debate initially about the title of the first chapter. trying to keep it consistent with the others, and he really insisted on that ultimate dichotomy, and I think that's absolutely fitting. I'm glad we went that direction, because it is the ultimate dichotomy. This first chapter is extremely powerful and a heart-wrenching one, frankly, to read. It's about this dichotomy for leaders on the battlefield, that you care and love for your troops, your men, more than anything in the world, and yet you're having to send them out on missions that could very well get them killed or horribly wounded. And that's trying to balance that as a leader, that the mission comes first, and yet you have so much deep respect and admiration and love for your men, and how to balance that. And obviously that's something that applies to business teams as well. When you're in a situation where you care about the employees, each individual employee, and yet sometimes a business has to make a decision to let a few employees go so that they can do what's best for the entire company and look out for the entire team or the mission over any one individual. And that's what that first chapter is about. And this section is definitely a very, very strong one that I think will resonate with leaders.
Yeah, and you can go down the list on the slide there, talking about owning everything, but at the same time, you can't own everything and not give any ownership to your people. So you have to own things, but you have to empower your team. You have to be resolute, of course, and hold the line with things, but at the same time, you can't be overbearing with your troops. And then one question we get asked all the time, which we put as the fourth chapter in this section, is when to mentor someone and keep bringing them along. And as a leader that's practicing extreme ownership, you think, well, there's nothing wrong with my team, it's my fault. Well, sometimes you get to a point with an individual on a team where you've done everything you can, and it's hard to know when to let that person go and move on. So we address that in this chapter, and that rounds out the first section of balancing people.
And frankly, that last one, when to mentor, when to fire, I mean, that's, to Jocko's point, it's very, very difficult, but this is just a great example of how this is a much deeper dive into some of the same subject matter of extreme ownership, and something that people struggle with. They interpreted, this idea. We said no bad teams, only bad leaders, and that's absolutely true. No bad teams, only bad leaders. The leader is the one who shapes and molds that team and gets everybody working together, and make sure they're trained, and make sure they have the resources, and make sure they understand the greater commander's intent, the overall strategic mission. But that doesn't mean that everybody on the team is going to be successful, and you got to be able to make those tough calls. And so this is a real, the folks who have read the manuscript already, the leaders who had dug deep into extreme ownership, where that particular chapter has really stood out to them to help them understand that, not everybody's going to eventually be a part of the team necessarily, and you got to do all you can, certainly, to help those folks. Most people don't need to be fired; they need to be led. However, there are times where you just you've done all you can to train, mentor, and help people, and they're not going to be able to perform at the standard you need them to, and you got to do what's best for the team.
Can we go to the next slide, Michelle? So next slide, again, the setup is the same in all the chapters, but next thing we focused on was balancing the mission. And we talk about things in there of training hard. And of course, in any situation, you have to train hard, but at the same time, you can work so hard in your training, you can actually overtrain. So leaders have to balance that so they're not pushing their team so far. Another one that came up that we knew we had to write about was being aggressive, right? In the first book, and we talk a lot of times about being default aggressive, and that's got to be your mode. You got to make things happen. But at the same time, you have to balance that, because if you're just nothing but aggressive all the time, well, first of all, you might take risks that are unnecessary, and number two, you could do damage to your team because you're not correctly assessing what the risks and threats are. So that's one of the things you need to balance. Leif, you want to hit discipline but not rigid?
Absolutely. This continues on and on and on. Jocko's mantra that so many people are familiar with: discipline equals freedom. Discipline in all things, in the small things, and that exercise of discipline in the smallest things translates to bigger things. And discipline, standard operating procedures for teams, enables you the freedom to excel on the battlefield at a very high level, or the business world at a very high level as well. And yet, you can't be rigid. And this is a really difficult struggle. And it's a great example of that. We gave several examples of where, in particular, Jocko held the line for us as a task unit and said, hey, we're not going to allow you to underperform. You need to meet the standard. And then there's also another example where Jocko let some things go, where I thought I was about to get smashed by his authority there for blatantly disregarding a direct order. And yet, he let it slide because he realized that it wasn't that big of a deal, and what we were doing would help unit cohesion. So while he never told us it was okay, he didn't come down hard and smash us. And I think people look at Jocko or they look at me and think, hey, these guys are going to be disciplined and they're going to hold the line in all things. And there's some absolute standards that just cannot be compromised. There's no question about that. And yet, you can't be a slave driver for your team. I mean, you can't be an effective leader if you're constantly smashing them down, and particularly if you're picking things that are not strategically important and really trying to harp on those things. That basically burns your leadership capital, we call it, your ability to actually lead your team and for them to listen to you when it really matters. And so it goes on holding your people accountable, but not holding their hands. And this is one, you know, I wrote in Extreme Ownership, it's not what you preach, it's what you tolerate. And so it's not what you say, it's not what you put up on the PowerPoint slides on the wall or the banners. It's actually what you tolerate that becomes the standard. So if you're tolerating less than substandard performance, that's a problem. And yet, one thing that's really misunderstood from Extreme Ownership was this idea of accountability, and that Jocko talks about in this chapter, which is one that really resonated with me. That while accountability is important, and there's times when you have to say, hey, listen, we didn't perform as good as we should, we need to do that again. If accountability is which is probably the biggest misconception that we have with leaders, like, we need more accountability. But if you're leading only through accountability, that means that you're standing over someone's shoulder and they're doing exactly what you want them to do while you're there. But as soon as you're not there, then they're not doing it. So it's far more effective to explain why we have to achieve that certain standard, what's at stake if we don't do that, and then people will hold themselves accountable, and that's much more powerful. And that's what Jocko explains in detail in this chapter, both with that combat example, elaboration on the principle, and then a direct application to the business world.
Michelle, let's go to the next one. Balancing yourself. These are some good solid chapters. Again, it's one of those things where with Extreme Ownership, we're telling everyone all the time, hey, you got to be a leader, you got to be a leader, you got to be a leader. But what we failed to really truly emphasize strongly enough was that sometimes you got to be a follower. And in the first chapter in this section, Leif does a really great job of talking about examples where he was on the battlefield and he was in a leadership position, but it was more effective for him to actually follow what was happening. And as leaders, we have to be comfortable and secure enough with ourselves and our leadership capability that if someone else steps up and takes charge, you go, okay, you know what? I'm going to follow, I'm going to support that person, and we're going to move forward. The other thing that Leif did a good job talking about, and this is something that catches everyone in the business world and in the military, is planning things. And we talk about planning. We have a whole chapter in Extreme Ownership about planning. But here's the deal. If you go too far with planning, guess what? You now haven't executed anything because you're spending all your time just planning and planning and planning and planning. We see that with businesses. We see that with military units. They plan so much that they never execute, or they get so detailed with the plans that they forget what the actual broad thing that they're trying to get accomplished is. They get so caught up in the minutia. So yes, you have to plan, but at the same time, the dichotomy is if you overplan, it's going to end up hurting you instead.
And it continues on, those dichotomies: humble, not passive. I mean, we talk about all the time. Probably the most common question that we get is, what is the greatest quality in a leader? And the answer is humility. And we wrote about that very extensively in Extreme Ownership. Jocko wrote an awesome chapter about checking your ego and how important that is to be humble and to stay humble. And on the battlefield, just as in life, it's be humble or get humbled. And yet you can't be passive. You cannot be passive. It is incumbent on any leader, any member of the team. If you're getting direction to do something that you know is destructive to the mission, that is dangerous, that is not going to help you achieve your goals in the long run, then you have to push back. You have to push that information up the chain of command. You can't just passively follow along. And so that's a very difficult thing, because while you have to be a good follower and you have to do what your boss tells you to do in the direction from higher, you also can't be passive when it comes down to providing that direct feedback. And that's something that's really difficult to balance, but it's critically important for any leader. You also have to be focused but not detached. And I use some examples here of how getting too down in the weeds cause a lot of issues for any leader. That this detachment, we talked about it in Extreme Ownership, and we talk about it all the time with our company, Echelon Front. Detachment is one of the most important things that a leader can do, because if you're down in the weeds, you can't see the bigger picture. It's hard to prioritize properly. So you got to detach, you got to step back and see the bigger picture. And yet you can't be too detached. If you're too far back from the details, then you can't support your team. You can't lead your team, and things start getting missed, and corners start getting cut, and then it becomes a major problem. And I wrote about one of those issues where I got really burned hard by getting too focused on other areas, and I was too detached in other areas, and the team was not doing what they needed to do, and they got off track, and we had a major issue. That's a problem. So that's a difficult balance for any leader, but one that you have to recognize is absolutely crucial. And as we talk about, the dichotomies, one of the most powerful tools a leader has is just the recognition that the dichotomies exist. And so you're never going to be in perfect equilibrium. You'll be out of balance in one area. You focus on that area, you get that area back in balance, you realize you're out of balance in another area. But just the recognition that you have to balance these dichotomies, that this idea of extreme ownership, while is crucial, leadership seldom requires anything that's extreme. You don't want to be on the extreme ends, one end or the other. You want to be in the middle. You want to be balanced. And so that recognition alone, that there are these dichotomies that you must balance, I think is a super important tool that can help leaders be successful. And that's why I think the content in this book is going to be really useful for leaders, particularly those that loved extreme ownership, and for those that maybe haven't even read extreme ownership.
Let's go to the next slide, Michelle. So as Leif just pointed out, and as we pointed out in the book, the dichotomies of leadership, they're infinite. And there's for every good quality that a leader might have, if they go too far or too extreme with that good quality, it can become a negative quality. In fact, it often does. And so as a leader, the more, as Leif just said, the more you can maintain that balance, and it's something that you constantly have to modulate and adjust. The better job you do of that, the better chance you have of achieving your goal of victory for you and your team. So that's what the book is about. Next slide, Michelle. All right, looks like we got some questions from the interwebs and various sources. So Michelle, you want to run us through these?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and kick off the questions. But first, I just wanted to say, for those of you, thank you, Leif and Jocko, for giving us a little peek into what the book is all about. For those of you who have read Extreme Ownership already, I will say that I think that Dichotomy of Leadership really nicely complements it. It is just a great extension on the material that's already introduced, and introducing new concepts and different settings. And I really enjoyed even discussing the sections with companies that you featured who had already been exposed to extreme ownership principles, but then needed to take it a step further and, further work on how they can better execute on their mission. So I love that about the book. And then also, for those who haven't read Extreme Ownership, it's definitely not a sequel. I think that you guys do such a great job of setting up all of the principles ahead of time if you're discussing a principle that's mentioned in the first book. And I think, we actually are an office that's 90% female, no military background or experience. But the concept that you guys introduce and the stories that you tell, it really resonates with everyone, and we are such big fans. So I think that you guys did a phenomenal job with both books, and I'm really excited for everybody to check out the new one. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it off with the first question. All right, so we have two questions from George. The first question is for Leif. Intense situational training is the discipline applied in the combat context. What approach would you take for the same effect on a team of project managers in a business context?
The exact same approach. The exact same approach. I mean, you need to put your team into uncomfortable situations that are realistic, that focus on the fundamentals, and that training's got to be repetitive. You got to be able to do it over and over and over again. Training shouldn't be just for the new folks on the team. And it's one of the biggest misconceptions that we get. People say, well, you guys have been through all this training, so it's different from what I have with my team at my company. And so then we ask, well, where's your training program? And oftentimes the training program doesn't exist. Maybe there's some, small training program for new hires as they come on board. But you need to put your team in those same intense situational, that intense situational training that you have for your project manager. So no matter what you do, I mean, we use things as simple as like a role play exercise. So, if you're dealing with a problem customer, a problem client, or a third party subcontractor, or just another member of the team, and you want to have someone deal with that situation better, then have a role play exercise. You can have the senior leader or someone that experienced to play a certain part, and you can actually role play that exercise. And through iterations, you can get exponentially better in performance through 1, 2, 3, 4 iterations of training. So all it is about getting the team outside the comfort zone. And people generally don't like to do that. They don't like to role play. They don't like to be in intense situations. But there's plenty of, even if it's not life and death for your business team, there's plenty of higher pressure situations where you got to make decisions now in a fairly ambiguous environment, and there is no 100% right solution. And you can prepare your team to better execute in that environment by putting them in realistic training.
Awesome. Thank you, Leif. And actually, George, definitely check out chapter 5, which talks about this concept of training. And it also starts with a phenomenal story that kept me on my toes the entire time. So that was a great chapter. For Jocko, default aggressive is your go-to approach for problem solving. What is your go-to dichotomy you focus on when developing a new leader?
Well, clearly, we can talk about the dichotomy on both these statements here. Default aggressive is absolutely a great way to get problem solved. But at the same time, if you think to yourself, oh, I've got a solution for this problem and I'm just going to keep going until I get that problem solved, and maybe your solution wasn't that good, but you keep going anyway, and you end up burning out yourself or your troops or your team because you wouldn't take a step back and say, you know what, this doesn't seem to be the best solution. So default aggressive is a good mindset to have, but you can't follow it relentlessly. You have to balance it with taking assessment and making sure that you're making the right decision and you're leading in the right direction. As far as developing new leaders, this is all about the dichotomy, because as you're developing a new leader, what you want to balance is you want to give them responsibility, but you want to make sure that it doesn't bury them. So you want to let them try and maybe let them make some small mistakes along the way. But if they start getting so far off track that it's going to negatively impact the team or the mission, then you have to bring them back, and you just constantly balance that. You can't make the mistake of doing everything for them or never letting them make any decisions on their own, because then they're not learning. So you want to give them enough room to maneuver around, but don't let them get so far off track that they do damage to themselves or the team or the mission. That's what you have to balance when developing a new leader.
Awesome. All right, let's go to the next question from Cole and Charles. So these were submitted via Twitter and handwritten by each person. So starting with Cole, who's age 7. I am 7 years old. What are some workouts I can do?
Okay, so good workouts for young warrior kids to do if you're 7 years old. Here's one. Start by setting up a timer for 2 minutes and see how many push-ups you can do in 2 minutes, and then take a minute rest, and then see how many sit-ups you can do in 2 minutes, and then take a minute rest, and then if you have a pull-up bar, see how many pull-ups you can do in 2 minutes. And what you do is you just keep doing that every day. It doesn't take that long, but you'll see as time goes on, you'll get stronger and stronger, and then eventually you'll be doing so many push-ups and pull-ups and sit-ups in that short period of time that you might need to go to 3 minutes, and you can keep building on that. That's a good place to start out.
Awesome. I might try that as well.
Get after it, Michelle.
You got to start somewhere, right? Okay. And then the second question is from Charles, age 11. How do I deal with my jealous emotions? And how do I deal with an annoying sibling?
So with jealous emotions, if you think about what you're concentrating on when you're being jealous, what you're concentrating on is what someone else has, instead of concentrating on what you could do better. So when you start feeling yourself getting jealous about something, the best thing to do, Leif already talked about it today, is you got to detach, you got to take a breath and step back and not focus on what the other person has that you might not have. Focus on what you can do for yourself and how you can improve your situation. Not worrying about what someone else has or what someone else can do. Worry about yourself and focus on yourself, and that'll be helpful. Now, annoying siblings. I think everybody has those. I know I had 2 sisters growing up, and to say that they were annoying is an understatement, because obviously when you got sisters and brothers running around, they can be very, very annoying. So what we have to do when they start annoying, and I had a great guy on my podcast named Captain Charlie Plum, and he was in a communist prison camp for 6 years. And in that prison camp, he had roommates, cellmates that he had to live with, and they had a rule. They had a rule, which was if your cellmate is annoying you, it's not your cellmate's fault. It's your fault for allowing yourself to get annoyed. So if someone is annoying you or something is annoying you, you have to say to yourself, I'm not going to let that bother me. I know in the SEAL team, sometimes we'd have to sit out and stay still for a very long period of time. We'd have to sit on ambush. And I remember when I was going through training, flies were landing on me, little flies, and they're pecking at my skin. And it was very, very annoying. And what I had to say was, I'm going to be disciplined. I'm not going to let these flies bother me. I'm going to be strong, and I'm just going to let them crawl around on me, and I'm going to stay still like I'm supposed to. So think of it as a challenge. If someone's annoying you, accept it and try and ignore it and concentrate on what you're doing instead.
And that's
I
great
have
advice.
one addition to make for to Cole for the workouts, and that is if you can't do pull-ups, you can just do bar hangs. And Jocko's daughter, I think, was about 7 years old. We were out in his garage, and they were just doing bar hangs. How long can you hang from the bar? And so just challenge yourself. And I remember him standing underneath her. His arms are there. He's obviously gonna catch her, but he says, "Don't fall. I'm not gonna catch you." She's like, "Please, Daddy, catch me!" And of course, he caught her. But if you can't do pull-ups, you can do some bar hangs. And you do bar hangs, time those, get better and better and better, and eventually you're doing pull-ups.
Awesome. All right. So the next question is from Mark. What if you want to give up on something for a more lucrative endeavor, but also don't want to quit or leave a good company hanging?
I think the best thing to do in a situation like that is be straightforward, plan out, make sure that you're taking care of the company that you're leaving. If the company is a good company, and that's probably why you don't feel like you should quit, then they're going to be enthusiastic about other opportunities that arise for you. Maybe they might even say, hey, you know what, don't go there for that opportunity. We can make that opportunity here, and then you get the best of both worlds. But good companies and good leaders, they want to see their people succeed. And you succeeding for the team or you succeeding for them, for their sake, they'd rather have you go out and do something that's gonna help you and see you do better. So I think what you do is you just be straightforward. Hey, here's what's going on. Here's the situation I've been presented with. I want to make sure I take care of all my obligations here and set the team up for success. I don't want to leave you guys hanging, but I do want to move forward and have more opportunities. I want to take advantage of that. I hope you understand and you do your best to assist them as you move on.
And I think that actually applies to companies where you maybe don't like the situation and you want to leave the situation too. We talk to people about that all the time. You know, they see a better opportunity, they want to follow a different path, and they're a little frustrated by a boss they're working for, or another team member, you know, or the mission, the team that's surrounding them. And you know, it never does you any good to burn bridges and create antagonistic relationships. It's always in your best interest to leave on the best terms possible, and I think you have to do that. You know, help that company succeed, set them up for success, do a great turnover with others, be straightforward about what you're doing. So whether you love the company you work for or don't, that's always the right call.
Awesome. All right. Next question is from Angie. I was recently in a situation where a senior person derailed a meeting by engaging in yelling and profanity. First, how do you recommend regaining order of the situation? Secondly, how do you recommend addressing the senior staff member about their behavior? And lastly, how can management get staff members to trust their leaders when they witness situations like this?
You know, if I had someone that, go ahead, Leif.
This is something that, you know, Jocko and I talk about pretty regularly, and it's there is, when you've got someone like that, I mean, when someone's behaving like that, I think you just have to say that's inappropriate. You know, I think you can do, but you have to remain calm. It never does you any good to spin up or get emotional, and that's hard to do. That's very hard to do when someone's yelling or screaming at you or using profanity at you. But as Jocko talked about, that detachment is important. You got to detach yourself from that. You remain calm, and you're gonna always come out in a much better situation. But I think that's what you can just say is like, listen, that's inappropriate. We can't have that. And I think addressing that in a calm manner is a way to do that. And then you want to make sure that that is addressed, so that it's not something that happens again. We talk about pretty regularly, something that Jocko taught me, because as you can tell, I'm a pretty aggressive person, and I can lose my temper fairly easily. And get spun up, and I have to really work on that. I definitely have to focus on that detachment, and it's something that I struggle with. But something that Jocko taught me is that really losing your cool like that is a sign of weakness. I mean, you really have to, it just means that someone else got under your skin, that you're not in control of your own emotions. And so we each have to really battle against that. And so I think that's something that all of us need to get under control.
Yeah, I think from a tactical level, how do you regain the order of the situation? You've got to say, hey, look, why don't we take a little break? Let's take a little break and cool off a little bit, something like that. And then you might want to pull the person aside and say, hey, listen, it's kind of like what Leif just said. Hey, listen, right now, if we're getting super emotional about this, people aren't going to listen to what we're saying. We need to kind of look at this from a logical perspective, and we need to lead from a point of calm. And so I think if you address it like that you're just trying to support them, but the way that we're going to get the best support from the team is by coming across as calm, cool, collected leaders. And then how do we get the management, how do we get the staff members to trust the leaders after they see that? Well, you got to play that a little bit carefully, but one thing you can say is like, look, we've got leaders, our leaders are passionate about what we're doing. They really care. They get emotional about it sometimes. And we got to try and transfer that emotion into passion for what we're doing. And let's listen to what they're saying and not get spun up and affected by, if their emotions get out of control. Let's try and capture what they're saying that is important and move forward from that.
All right. Next question is from Brian. How do you build a team of salespeople with #GetSome mentality when only offering straight commission?
I think this is, if you've got people, this is forming a gang mentality is what you want to do. You've got some people, you got a team, and they're working off a straight commission. This is a group of people that we eat what we kill. We got to go out and hunt it down every day. And you develop that mentality like, look, we're not zoo animals, right? We're not going to get fed unless we go out and hunt and kill what we're going to bring home and eat. So I think developing that kind of gang mentality of working together and competing against each other while at the same time supporting each other, I think that's what you have to do.
I think you also have to realize too that this is, we get questions like this all the time, and really the premise of this question is that, well, it's harder for us in this situation than it is for other people. And you can't allow that to happen, right? Because we work with companies all the time that wish they were on straight commission when they're getting a modest salary that's maybe not near as lucrative as it could be if they were on commission. So you got to look at that and say, look, this is a huge opportunity. You're on straight commission. Okay, maybe that means you're going to be, you're going to be pinching pennies for a little bit until we get this thing up and running. But once we do, it's going to be awesome. Let's make it happen. So one thing for leaders, team members, you can't allow yourself to say, well, it's harder for me than it is for other people, because believe me, there's other people that have it way harder than you. And so don't use that as an excuse, because that's only going to keep you from doing the hard work to perform at the level that you need to succeed.
Here's a question from Joel. I've tried to live and practice extreme ownership and discipline equals freedom in both work and personal life, resulting in enormous impact for me, my teams, and my family. However, I'm dealing with end-stage blood-bone cancer, and I'm having a challenge owning the daily situations and having a daily discipline through the pain to remain strong, maintain who I want to be, and accomplish more and not give up. Good seems not to register with me sometimes when the pain is so bad. I want to go out finishing strong and with discipline, but I'm struggling with ownership of all of this and with discipline. I could use some practical suggestions.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is, you've been dealt a hand that is very heavy and very hard, and that's going to be clearly very difficult to deal with. As far as what's good in this situation, well, one thing I can think of right off the bat is you're still here. You still have the opportunity to communicate with people. You still have the opportunity to experience things and pass on lessons that you learned in your life, and that's a beautiful thing. If you think about some other ways that people leave this world, they leave it in an instant, and they don't have a chance to talk to people. They don't have a chance to say things that maybe they never had the chance to say. So that all those things that I just talked about, that's the best possible way you can look at it. That's the best possible way to say it's good. The other thing I'd say is this: look, you're going to go through some horrible pain and suffering, and I look at it like this: that for you is an opportunity to show your loved ones, number one, how to do this with dignity, how to live your life to the fullest, even under the direst of situations. And I think with that, you can leave a legacy of inspiration for everybody that knows you. And that's something that these people, the people that you know, the people that you touch, will carry with them for the rest of their lives. And that's a very powerful impact you can have on everybody around you. And I think if you look at it with that attitude, keep your head up, fight as hard as you can, and show people what it means to go out and to stay strong until the end.
We'll certainly lift you up in our prayers, Joe. And thank you for your question, and God bless you and your family.
All right. Moving on to Gustav. Do you believe that great leaders are born or made? What has your experience taught you on that subject?
Well, Jocko and I have worked with a lot of different leaders, and this is something that we saw all the time. This is a question that so many people wrestle with. Look, there's no question that that there are people who are born with charisma and the ability to draw other people to them, and maybe have a little more of a natural ability to stand up in front of a group and talk to them or get them behind a certain thing, and yet regardless of those folks, if the people who actually become great leaders are those people who are humble, who are constantly looking in the mirror to try to get better all the time. And when I was running the SEAL leadership training program for every SEAL officer that graduated from our SEAL course, I saw leaders that came in that struggled with some of those things and maybe didn't have some of those innate, natural born gifts that you might expect a leader to have, and yet they became effective leaders because they learned, they listened, they took notes, they looked hard in the mirror. And some of those folks who had some of those innate qualities and a little more natural born gifts struggled because they didn't listen, they didn't learn, they weren't humble. So I think that you can absolutely get better no matter who you are. And while there's an argument to be made that maybe you can't make someone who's a bad leader great, you can certainly get a whole lot better and become an effective leader simply by checking your ego, willing to listen, willing to learn from others, take notes, read everything you can, and never think that you got it all figured out.
The other thing that you can do besides working on your own weaknesses and seeing how you can improve them. So for instance, if you're not good at public speaking, guess what? Go do public speaking until you get better at it. If you're not good at simplifying problems, guess what? Go look at complex things until you learn to simplify them better. And so you can improve yourself for sure. Again, you can only do that, as Leif pointed out, if you're humble enough to say, here's some areas that I need for improvement. We always say that the one leader that can't get any better, that can't improve, is the leader that's not humble at all and won't listen and doesn't try and improve. The other thing you can do as a leader is you can surround yourself with people that complement your weaknesses. So if you're not very good at simplifying something or simplifying problems, get someone on your team that is good at simplifying problems. If you're not very articulate when you get up in front of a crowd, until you get better at it, have someone on your team that is good in front of crowds and have them do some of the talking and some of the briefing so that everyone understands what the plan is. So there's things that you can do not only to improve yourself, but as you put your team together, you put people around you on your team that will complement your leadership weaknesses. And guess what? You'll only do that if you're secure enough. Some people are too insecure to let someone else get up and in front of the group and brief because they feel like it's going to make them look bad as a leader. No, it's not. It's fine. People will recognize, hey, this leader's secure enough in their own leadership capabilities that they don't mind someone else stepping up and getting some of the spotlight for a little while. It's not that big of a deal. So improve yourself and complement yourself with a good team that makes up for your weaknesses.
All right. Here's a question from Mike. I had my whole team at work read Extreme Ownership, and the language still permeates the culture today. I had my 12-year-old read it, and he has now chosen it for a reading presentation in the 7th grade. What advice around extreme ownership would you guys give a class of 7th graders as it applies to schoolwork and/or sports? My son would love to use your feedback in his presentation.
Here's what I would tell those 7th graders. What extreme ownership really means when you're in 7th grade, talking about sports and talking about academics, is no excuses. That's what it means. The dog didn't eat your homework. You left your homework out where the dog could get to it. That's not the dog's fault. That's your fault. Same thing with sports. If you make a mistake in sports, don't blame anyone else. Just look at the mistake that you made and see what you can do to improve and get better so you don't make that mistake again. That's the underlying current of extreme ownership, is we're not going to make any excuses. And when you stop making excuses, guess what? You start owning those problems, finding solutions for those problems, and that's when you improve.
And I think that the last chapter of extreme ownership, discipline equals freedom, right? Is that something that what we just talked about, how leaders improve is by disciplined effort over time. And so at 7th grade, maybe you're not the best athlete or the best student currently, and yet if you're disciplined and you work hard and work hard and work hard every day, week, month, and in a few years you're running circles around those folks that that maybe were better than you then. And so that's just the way it is. Discipline equals freedom. So get after it.
All right, next question is from Steve. What are your recommendations for a new leader who's currently in the weeds and tasked with building a team?
You got to get out of the weeds. You definitely got to get out of the weeds. This is something that Jocko always called stand back and be the tactical genius. And you want to empower the team, and certainly you got to dive into details. If you're a new leader, you need to ask questions. You need to be leaning on everybody's experience, and you certainly need to kind of figure out how things operate and where you can best support. But as a leader, you can't really lead your team if you're down into the weeds of things. So I'd be planning an operation. I'd come in and brief that op. Jocko, here's what we're doing. Give them a kind of a broad overview. But because we've been spending hours on the minutia of those tactical plans, he'd be able to look at the plan and see where the holes were, what we missed. And I always thought, man, how did he do that? How did he see that? Jocko must be this tactical genius. And then he told me a story about his platoon commander years before that had done that to him when he was a young enlisted man. And I thought that's exactly what he did to us, was standing back and be the tactical genius. So you can see those holes. You can see where the priority should be if you're out of the weeds, if you're detached. And so that should be your position of detachment. So make yourself knowledgeable, learn all you can, spend as much time on the front lines with your troops. But remember, your job as a leader is not to be in the weeds, but to be detached.
That's it.
Awesome. All right, moving on to Arthur. My question regards how to lead upwards. I work in a department that has very weak leadership. I have considered leaving, but I was wondering how I can improve the situation from the ground up. Supervisors aren't exactly open to leadership lessons from their employees, but there has to be more that I can do for my team and the organization.
Well, again, this is a question we get asked all the time, and this is something that I have a very easy answer for. I love having weak leaders. I love having weak leaders, because if I've got a weak leader, that means that gives me the opportunity to lead more and step up and lead my team and make the direction that we're going to go in, develop from my perspective and not from someone else's. Now, I'm going to be careful. There's a dichotomy. I don't want to go overboard and take so much leadership that people start to think I'm stepping on their toes up the chain of command. So I'm going to balance it. But when I have a weak leader that I have to work for, I'm going to embrace that situation. I'm going to step up and I'm going to lead even more.
All right, and I believe this is our last question from John. Any advice for striking a balance with relationships and different personalities in a very diverse team or organization?
Yeah, sure. So this is something that if you're a leader in any situation, in any organization, guess what that organization is filled with? That organization is filled with human beings. And all those human beings have different personalities. They've got different enthusiasm about different areas. They've got their ego that's pulling in one direction or the other. So what you have to do as a leader is you're going to have to balance this. You're going to have to modulate the way you treat people. And it's interesting because I'm not saying that you're going to treat everyone on a team differently, but the dichotomy is you are going to treat everyone on the team a little bit differently. You have to. People react differently to different types of guidance. So, if I've got one person that's working for me, and I might need to just say, hey, here's the mission, go get it done. And they're a front runner and they say, got it, and they run with it, and I barely even have to look at them again, and they go get that operation done. I might have someone else on the team that I say, hey, here's the mission. And they say, okay, how do you want me to do it? Which direction should I come in from? What people should I bring with me? And so what I want to do is I want to work with them and provide enough management to them so that they start to make decisions for themselves. And I'm going to move them in that direction. I'm going to start to funnel them towards an area of how I want them to be and how I want them to lead. I might also get someone that's so far gone that I tell them, here's the mission, go get it done. and they go beyond that mission. They start doing things that they weren't supposed to do. So I have to tighten up the reins on that person. So no matter who you have in your organization, everyone's going to have their own personalities, and you as a leader have to modulate the way you interact with them to make sure that they understand where you're coming from and what they're supposed to get done. You know, another thing we talk about it in the dichotomy of leadership. Just in the afterword of the dichotomy of leadership, we start naming off all these dichotomies that you face as a leader. And one of them, and this one I think strikes a chord with people, because everyone says, oh, you need to be direct as a leader. You need to be direct with your people and tell them what's going on. But can you be too direct as a leader? Well, the answer is yes, you can. And if you're too direct with as a leader, maybe you start offending people, or they start feeling like they're not capable of doing anything because you told them that they didn't do a good job, and they say, oh no, I'm not good at this job, and now I don't want to do anything, and I just want to stay still and not take any risks. And so you've been too direct as a leader. So that's too far in one direction. On the other hand, sometimes as a leader, you might not give clear enough direction. You might not be direct enough where now no one knows what you're talking about. They don't know what they should correct. They don't know what they should do differently. And so you have to put a little bit more directness into what you're saying. So this question is true. And what you have to do is you have to basically set up a internal intrinsic feedback loop. As you work with people, you monitor how they're reacting to it, and then you modulate one way or the other. You get more extreme, you get less extreme, you get balanced, so that you get the behavior that you want from your team, so that they know what direction they're supposed to be heading. They can go out and they can get their job done.
I think John's going to really like the book, The Dichotomy of Leadership, because it's all about that, as Jocko just said. And I think so often what's tough about balancing these dichotomies is you don't know you don't know you're out of balance until it's very clear you've gone too far in one direction. So that's why I was saying earlier, just the knowledge that these dichotomies exist allows you to then rebalance that, when you can clearly say, wow, I've gone too far in that one direction. Now I got to balance back in the other.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. You guys talk about this exact topic in the beginning of chapter 4. So John, check out the book. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for being with us today. And thank you to all of the attendees for joining and for submitting your questions. We'll be choosing 2 of you to win a signed copy next week. So be sure to check your email. As a reminder, we'll be sending out a recording of this webinar next week if you'd like to share it with anyone. You can also visit our website at bkp.al/dichotomy to purchase the Dichotomy of Leadership for your organization, or you can send me an email directly at michelle@book-pal.com to learn more. We hope everybody enjoyed the webinar. Thank you, Jocko and Leif, so much for joining us. And get after it, everybody.
Thanks for having us on, Michelle.